welcome all of our speakers and everyone following this online symposium. I am delighted to introduce our first speaker and the honorandus of this event, Dr. Norman Russell, whose translation, as we just heard, of On the Orthodox Faith by John of Damascus was published this year by St. Vladimir's Seminary Press. Dr. Russell was born in Belfast, Northern Ireland, to an Irish Protestant father and a Greek Orthodox mother from Constantinople. His parents met in Egypt during the Second World War, where his father served the British forces as a pharmacist, and his mother was assigned as his dispensing assistant. Dr. Russell, somewhat whimsically, therefore, attributes his origins not only to God, but to the decision of a British military clerk. After the war, the family moved to London, where Dr. Russell completed a BA in English language and literature at King's College in 1968. He continued his studies at the University of Oxford, where he completed a degree in theology in 1970. It was at Oxford that he acquired his lifelong interest in the Fathers of the Church. After a period of several years, he returned to Oxford for doctoral studies under the supervision of the late Metropolitan Kallistos Ware. His thesis became the book that is probably known to all of you, The Doctrine of Deification in the Greek Patristic Tradition, published in 2004 by Oxford University Press. Dr. Russell has written a large number of important articles and monographs, including a recent book, Gregory Palamas and the Making of Palimism in the Modern Age, published in 2019. The greater part of his efforts, however, have been devoted to the translation of patristic and Byzantine theological texts, for which his degrees in English literature and in the theology of the Church Fathers have served him well. Owing to a rather fortuitous event, his career as a translator began when he was an undergraduate. While traveling in Greece, he met a young woman who did typing work for Philip Sherrard. She told him that Sherrard was looking for someone to help him with a translation project. The project in question was the Philokalia, of which Dr. Russell produced the initial translation of Volume 2 and much of Volumes 4 and 5. As many of you will know, nearly the whole of Volume 2 contains works by Maximus the Confessor, while Volume 5 is comprised of works by later Hesychast writers, such as Kallistos Angelikoudis and Kallistos and Ignatius Xanthopoulos, which is to say that these volumes contain probably the most difficult Greek in the entire Philokalia. Over the course of his long and prolific career, Dr. Russell has translated The Lives of the Desert Fathers, also known as the anonymous History of the Monks of Egypt, The Ladder of Divine Ascent by John Climacus, selected exegetical and dogmatic works by Cyril of Alexandria, the Festal Letters and other writings of Theophilus of Alexandria, and recently in 2020, The Life of Gregory Palamas by Philotheos Kokkinos. The Life of Palamas was published together with a translation of 4 synodal documents, synodal tomes, canonizing the theology of the Hesychasts, along with 4 letters of Gregory Palamas. These are all key primary sources documenting the Palamite controversy and the historical events of Palamas's career. Altogether, they mark an absolutely extraordinary contribution to the study of late Byzantine theology, since this is the first time that most of these works have appeared in English. Dr. Russell's most recent translation, as I stated a moment ago, is On the Orthodox Faith by John of Damascus. The translation is accompanied by Boniface Cotter's Greek text, which was published in 1973. The previous English translation of this work by Frederick Chase of St. John's Seminary in Boston was published in 1958. Chase's translation was based on the Greek text published in Patrologia Graeca, which was actually a reprint of the 18th century edition by Michel Lequien. Dr. Russell's translation now supplants the work of Chase and will undoubtedly remain the standard translation for many years to come. Alongside his translations of patristic and Byzantine works, Dr. Russell has also distinguished himself as a translator of modern Greek theologians and philosophers, including Panayotis Nellas, Christos Giannaras, Nikolaos Rudovicos, Stelios Ramphos, and the historian Venedictos Englezakis. To borrow a line from the Epistle to the Hebrews, time would fail me to tell of Dr. Russell's many translations from French, German, and Italian. His current projects include a revised edition of his Doctrine of Deification book, which will incorporate the Latin Fathers, a book on the Orthodox Church in the late Byzantine period, and translations of John of Damascus's philosophical chapters, also known as the Dialectica, and on heresies, which together will complete what is traditionally known as the trilogy called the Fount of Knowledge. Let me say in conclusion that the work of a translator is far more difficult than most people imagine. Those who have translated nothing at all, or who have translated only short passages, may perhaps think that translation is simply a matter of looking up words in a dictionary. But this is not at all the case. The translator must come to terms with the entire work. He has to account for every word, every particle of the text, with all its subtleties and shades of meaning, which usually means that no one knows a text as well as its translator. It's also true that texts are introduced to readers through translations, and this is the case even for scholarly readers who may know the original languages, but don't have the time to comb through hundreds of pages of Greek or Latin. Translators are therefore vital to patristic and Byzantine studies, and of course, the humanities in general. Many years ago, at a Byzantine studies conference, Alice Mary Talbot shocked the participants when she reported that the majority of papers given over the last 10 years at the BSc were not engaged with the Byzantine period at all, but rather with late antiquity. In the discussion that followed, it was agreed that the reason for this discrepancy was the simple availability of translations. In other words, while most texts from the late antique period were available in English, comparatively few, at that time anyway, were available from the Byzantine period. Dr. Russell, it is a pleasure to be with you. We are indebted to you for your remarkable contributions to the field of patristic and Byzantine theological studies. Your tireless work as a translator for over a period of more than 40 years places you in a category all your own. The Papist Patristic Institute is honored and delighted to have you here with us today. And without further ado, I invite you to take the floor. Dr. Russell's paper is called A Merely Compilatory but Correct Theologian, the Christology of St John of Damascus. Please join me in welcoming him. Dr. Russell, you have the floor.
Right. Thank you very much for that introduction, which is quite overwhelming, really. Anything I say now is bound to be an anticlimax, but I can begin by saying that I appreciate very much what you say about the work of a translator, coming, of course, from a distinguished translator yourself. You know what you're talking about, and it is, as you say, not knowing words, but it's entering into the mindset, the cultural world of the writer you're translating. You have to just not know a text. You have to know what he's doing and why and how. And of course, Greek is such a subtle language that you mentioned, the particles. That's you've only got to look at Denison's book on Greek particles to realize how all these apparently inconsequential little 2-letter and 3-letter words all are markers which influence the sense. So that I've enjoyed translation, which, as you say, I've done for quite a long time. And I teamed up with Philip Sherard very early, as you say, as an undergraduate. At first, I was working for him quite a negre. I was doing work for him, which was his work. But when I was invited to join the team producing the initial translations of for the Philokalia, I was set a text as an exam, just to see what I could do. And the text happened to be something of, it happened to be a text of St John of Damascus. So I was introduced to him by the Philokalia, but didn't pursue my, my knowledge of him until I was asked by Father Ignatius to translate the ekdosis, the exposition of the exposition of the Orthodox faith, which I'm convinced by what Dr. Vasa Kontuma says, that ekdosis doesn't mean exposition, it means edition. It's the title that the Byzantine editor gave, an accurate edition of John Damascene's work on the Orthodox faith. I just feel instinctively, intuitively that is right. And as Dr. Kontuma will no doubt explain later, the Fount of Knowledge is really an invention of Michel Lequien, and that's why I was happy to translate the ekdosis first, but the translations of the philosophical chapters and on heresies is coming in a subsequent volume. I've already been asked to do that, and I'm very happy to continue this. I did not know much really about the world of John of Damascus. He's an outlier as far as the Byzantine tradition is concerned. And it was through studying the work of Dr. Kontuma and of Dr. Scott Abels as well that I began to enter into this different cultural world and see that the center of Byzantine orthodoxy in the 8th century was not in Constantinople, it was in Palestine. This is where the main Greek scholars were. This is where the Greek was being done, the Greek theology was being done. So this leads me into this merely compilatory but correct theologian. This is the supreme value we put on originality in a writer is a modern concern. Whereas ancient scholars, say Jerome, investigated a text for heresy, that's what was most interesting, their modern counterparts tend to be on the lookout for plagiarism, a concept that only dates from early modern times when the invention of printing made a work more easily ownable than in the past. Now, it was Dr. John Dimitrakopoulos who dismissed John of Damascus as a church father, calling him a merely compilatory and correct theologian, which is in fact how the Damascene himself regarded his theological enterprise. Dimitrakopoulos is a brilliant scholar who's done much to uncover John's unacknowledged sources, but his use of the charge of plagiarism as a put-down is anachronistic. John is careful to acknowledge most of the material he cites from Gregory of Nazianzus, by far his most frequent source, and also from Athanasius, Cyril, Basil, Gregory of Nyssa, and Dionysius the Areopagite in the order of frequency of citation, because these were universally recognized fathers who carried authority. He uses material from writers who were to him relatively modern, rather differently. These writers are principally Nemesius of Emesa and Maximus the Confessor, we can leave aside the material attributed by modern scholars to pseudo-Cyril, which Vasa Kontoma has demonstrated was not appropriated by John from an earlier writer, but was actually lifted from him in the 14th century by a Byzantine scholar, Joseph the philosopher. It's interesting that substantial portions of Nemesius, equivalent to some 10 columns in Migne, are quoted verbatim without acknowledgement and with only a little editing to remove references to Greek philosophers and to Origen. Whereas Maximus is not given neat, but mostly paraphrased. Nemesius is valued for his anthropology, to which John has nothing of his own to add, so he doesn't interfere with the text. But Maximus' Christological arguments are closer to John's main Christological concerns, and consequently, his discussions are adapted to fit the points John wants to make. These points mostly concern Christology, a topic that dominates well over a third of the Orthodox faith of the Ekdosis. The centrality of Christology reflects the main purpose of the text, which is to give readers arguments with which to defend the Chalcedonian Diophysite doctrine of Christ. John was writing in Palestine, mostly for a monastic audience. And despite nearly a century of Umayyad rule, of Muslim rule, Chalcedonian Christians were still in the majority there. But so-called Monophysites, or Miaphysites in modern parlance, were well established. Moreover, the so-called Nestorians, the Syrians of the Church of the East, had an outpost in Palestine at the time. There was a strong Jewish community. There was also a Manichaean presence. And of course, Muslims, although not yet plentiful, enjoyed a privileged status. So even though the Jerusalem Patriarchate had recently been restored, Chalcedonian Christianity had no institutional clout in Palestine. It had to argue its Christological positions on its own merits. One of the models available to John was Gregory of Nyssa's catechetical discourse, on which he draws extensively without actually quoting very much. He even follows the structure of the catechetical discourse quite closely, and I'm sure we shall hear more about this from Father Ignatius Green. In his PPS translation of the text, Father Ignatius groups Gregory's 40 chapters under 4 headings. First, the Trinity, then creation up to the fall, then the economy of Christ, and then humanity's appropriation of the fruits of the economy through baptism and the Eucharist. Now, John follows a very similar pattern, like Gregory, giving the lion's share to the economy. For both writers, the aim is not to present a systematic theology, but to provide a practical handbook, each of them addressing the problems of his own time. At several points in the catechetical oration, for example, Gregory gives advice on how to answer objections. When the dialogue is with a Hellenist, he says, begin like this, or when arguing with a Jew, respond thus. John often does the same. At the beginning of chapter 52, for example, he says, if anyone asks concerning the Lord's natures, whether they refer to a continuous quantity or to a divided one, we reply, etc., etc. And this feature has been emphasized by the Byzantine editor who supplied the chapter headings. There are chapter headings such as, to those who say, if a human being consists of 2 natures and activities, it would be necessary to say that in the case of Christ, there are 3 natures and the same number of activities, because Christ is body and soul and God, you see. And then to those who say, if Christ has 2 natures, either you adore the creature when you worship the created nature, or you say that one nature is to be worshipped and not the other. And to those who ask whether Christ's hypostasis is created or uncreated, etc. Now, these are trick questions. In the face of Monophysite opponents, who seek to catch the Chalcedonians on the horns of a dilemma, John indicates the line to be pursued. The aim of the work is fundamentally apologetic. So how does John organize his Christological arguments? Well, first, he establishes the hypostatic distinction of the Word and the Spirit within the Trinity. If God has a word and a spirit, or breath, in Greek, pneuma, of course, is word and spirit. It even appears as gas in the text. As the Bible says, this cannot be something insubstantial that passes away, as in our own case, not with God. It must be something permanent and hypostatic, really subsistent. Now, this was an argument, incidentally, that was to prove useful later in debate with Muslims, as the Quran also speaks of the Word and the Spirit of God. Gregory Palamas, for example, was able to make effective use of it in his disputations with Muslims during his year of captivity in Ottoman Bithynia in 1355. But simply to claim that God's Word and Spirit are hypostatic could lead to a charge of tritheism. Hence John's novel application to the Trinity of the notion of perichoresis, a Christological term that he learned from Maximus the Confessor. Perichoresis means mutual coinherence. In the case of the Trinity, a datum of revelation and therefore not negotiable, to quote John, he says, "We say that the three hypostases are in one another," says John, "in order to exclude our introducing a plurality and community of gods." So perichoresis, having established the hypostatic status of Word and Spirit, he introduces perichoresis, which he borrows from Maximus's Christology, in order to avoid tritheism. For the threeness is real, not merely conceptual. Yet there's an identity of will, activity, power, and authority. The Word is God, just as the Spirit, the Father, and the Spirit are God. In his philosophical chapters, the Dialectica, which draw on Porphyry's isagogy and Aristotle's categories with a minimum of comment, John describes ousia as a reality, a pragma, that is self-existent. God himself is an ousia, even if he's hyperousios, beyond ousia, beyond being. Hypostasis is more difficult to define because, as Father Andrew Louth points out in his book on St John of Damascus, there's no help for John in Porphyry or Aristotle. The philosophical chapters describe hypostasis as ousia with accidents. That's chapter 31 of the longer version. But this is of no use in the exact exposition's discussion of the Trinity. In the latter context, the Cappadocians come to the rescue. For Basil, hypostasis is the ousia's mode of existence, tropos tis hyparxeos. For in Basil's view, reality is fundamentally hypostatic. An influence on John Damascene's development of Basil's insight is the Monophysite Christian philosopher John Philoponus, for whom ousia or nature is purely conceptual. For the Damascene too, ousia is no more than conceptual, existing only in the epinia, or the epinoia. In reality, there are only individual natures, only hypostases. But is that still the case when John comes to discuss the incarnation and the word's economy? Here he does treat ousia as a pragma. On the one hand, the ousia is merely conceptual. He says that the essence then is one thing, the hypostasis is another. The essence signifies the common and comprehensive species, the ethos of hypostases of the same kind, such as man or God, whereas the hypostasis indicates an individual, an atomon. The essence, he says, does not exist in itself, but is perceived in the hypostases. He says that in chapter 50. So although God is a species of which the word is an instantiation, there's no subsistent reality alongside the three hypostases that constitute the species. On the other hand, the divine ousia is a reality that can be enumerated in Christ. The hypostasis of the word, John says, was previously simple and became composite, syntheton, from two perfect natures of divinity and humanity. We might paraphrase this as that he says in chapter 51. I'm concentrating here on the 47 to 50 to 55, which is the sort of engine room of this stuff. And we can paraphrase what he says as what God is and what humanity is was synthesized in a particular human individual, Jesus Christ. Then he goes on to talk about the hypostasis of the word becoming flesh. At a particular point in time, the word became flesh, another datum of revelation, without ceasing to be God. So how is this to be explained in rational terms? Became a great challenge of Orthodox Christianity in the 5th century, and indeed has remained a challenge to the present day. What was entailed by the incarnation received conciliar definition for the first time at the Council of Chalcedon in 451, which talks about, in its definition, talks about one and the same Christ, Son, Lord, only begotten, acknowledged in two natures without confusion, change, division, or separation, the famous Chalcedonian adverbs, and not parted or divided into two persons, but one and the same Son, only begotten God, Word, Lord, Jesus Christ. But this definition only excludes the two extremes occupied by Eutyches and Nestorius, leaving a broad middle ground open to more than one interpretation. It did not satisfy the Miaphysites, who clung tenaciously to the Cyrillian slogan, one nature made flesh of God the Word, Miaphysis. To them, Chalcedonian diaphysitism encapsulated in the expression in two natures, rather than Cyril's from two natures, seemed crypto-Nestorian, implying two parallel realities. That's how the Miaphysites saw it. John meets this challenge head on, making one point after another that seeks to accommodate Miaphysite concerns as much as possible, the position that modern scholars call Neo-Chalcedonianism. He says, the Word himself became the hypostasis with regard to the flesh in chapter 46. And this is what we mean when we say that John's Christology is asymmetrical. The subject, the Word, is the subject of the hypostasis. He also says, we say that Christ is the name of the hypostasis, not applying it only in one way, but indicating that which exists of the two natures. Note the Cyrillian of the two natures here. He takes this on board. For in his natures, he says, this is from chapter 47, for his natures are joined in the hypostasis, since they have one composite hypostasis, by which he differs from the Father and the Spirit, and from his mother and us. How am I doing for time? I better speed up, I think. The phrase one composite hypostasis, or a single composite hypostasis, mia hypostasis synthetos, is an otherwise rare expression frequently used by John. No doubt he got it from Maximus the Confessor, though we also find it in the Acts of the Council of 649, which were probably composed anyway by Maximus, and in Justinian's Edictum Recte Fidei, which draws on the Acts of 649. In his little treatise Ad Marinum, Maximus contends against the Miaphysites that Severus of Antioch confuses nature and hypostasis. in his discussions of the incarnation, and against the extreme Diophysites that Nestorius' interpretation of union, in a very minimalist sense, requires him to posit two different subjects of activity. For if Nestorius had not thought that what had come about was if he had not thought that what had come about was a mere union, a psilin enosin, says Maximus, he would have said that a single composite hypostasis of Christ resulted from the union of the natures. Nestorius, though, just speaks of a union of gnomic wills, which for Maximus entails two different subjects. Drawing on this, John says, now what causes the heretics to fall into error is their saying that nature, physis, and hypostasis are the same thing. And that, in fact, is how Maximus opens his Ad Marinam, attributing this view to Severus. For we say that union is substantial, usiothis, that's to say true and not illusory. This is Maximus. This is John in chapter 47. And it is substantial, not as a single composite nature, mian syntheton physin, formed of two natures, but with the two natures truly united with each other in one composite hypostasis, mian hypostasin syntheton of the Son of God. Behind the Maximian Johannine distinction and also the Severan non-distinction of nature and hypostasis lies an opinion first expressed by the Platonist Simplicius, an Alexandrian contemporary of John Philoponus. Commenting on Aristotle's category, Simplicius says that there's no reason why the same thing should not exist in two categories to form a composite nature, ent, en syntheti, physi, syntactate. No, says John, insisting on a distinction between nature and hypostasis, not a composite nature, but a composite hypostasis. The one nature of the word became flesh means that the divinity was united with the flesh in a single hypostasis. The word remains the subject of the composite hypostasis. One should note, says John, that although we say that the Lord's natures interpenetrate each other, we know that the interpenetration comes from the divine nature. Again, the asymmetrical Christology. For this nature permeates all things just as it wills, but is itself permeated by nothing. So perichoresis is a rather one-sided kind of interpenetration. And the composite hypostasis that results precludes our saying that Christ's natures are two hypostatically. And drawing on a very suggestive passage in Gregory of Nazianzus' letter 101 to Avlavius, where Christ is described as allo ke allo, not allos ke allos, John argues that the whole of Christ, olos, is perfect God, but he is not wholly God, olon theon, because he's also man, contrasting in this way the nature, the olon, with the hypostasis, the olos, the subject. A few paragraphs further on, John explains in a much commented passage how, granted the difference between nature and hypostasis, logic can allow for two natures within a single hypostasis. The opening sentence of paragraph 55 is important. Nature is apprehended either as a pure concept, for in itself it has no subsistence, or as that which unites what is common, kinos, to all hypostases of the same spirit, and is called a nature observable in the species, ento ethi. I think I'll pass to the end now because I think I'm overdoing my slot that's assigned to me, and say that modern scholars have commented negatively on the dry logical argumentation that characterizes the Christological discussions of this period. Admittedly, such argumentation does very little to nourish the soul. But once John has set out all his arguments against the Severan Miaphysite position, He's ready to discuss Christ's human and divine wills and begin to clothe his Christology with some human warmth. Confessing the same to be perfect God and perfect man, he says, we say that he has everything the Father has except unbegottenness, and everything that the first Adam had, with the exception only of sin. That is to say, a body and a rational and intelligent soul. With the acknowledgement that Christ has a body subject to suffering and a rational and intelligent soul that possesses free will, John is ready to embark on the discussion of Christ's humanity. To most modern Christians, a more congenial ground. Yet the philosophical journey up to that point has been a sine qua non for what comes later. So that really that brings me to the end of what I have to say on that.
Thank you very much.